What's up, guys? This is Steve from the Urban Worm Company, and today we're going to talk about worm bedding. Alright, so what is worm bedding? If you understand composting, you understand the relationship between carbon and nitrogen, where carbon are your browns and nitrogen are your greens. Worm bedding is a high carbon material that you will use in your worm bin to make sure that you have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So microbes thrive when the carbon to nitrogen ratio is about 30 to 1. Worms are going to thrive when the carbon to nitrogen ratio is about 50 to 1 or higher. So you want to make sure that A, you start out with a high carbon to nitrogen ratio with a lot of bedding in your worm bin, but also that as you keep adding food waste into your worm bin, that you're also adding bedding. You don't have to do it every time, but you have to do it enough to make sure that that ratio stays high enough to where the worms can thrive. Because what will happen is over time, the carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to decrease, which means the microbes are going to begin outcompeting the worms for the food. Now, this isn't that big of a deal because the worms are also eating the microbes. But in order for the worms to thrive, you want a carbon to nitrogen ratio that is pretty high up there, which is why your choice of worm bedding is really important. So speaking of choices of worm bedding, let's talk about that. So there are plenty of really good choices for worm bedding, and most of them are free. So let's talk about the first one. And that's aged horse manure. Now, I love aged horse manure. I'm kind of a lazy vermicomposter, and I find that aged horse manure is actually a really good sort of dual purpose bedding and food for the worms. Now, the cool part is that horse manure is normally free. The bad part is you've got to normally go somewhere to go get it, so it's not always the most convenient. Now, the next thing is shredded paper. I like shredded paper because it's free. There are things I don't like about shredded paper. A, you need to soak it, which you kind of need to soak most of your bedding anyway, but you really need to let the water saturate into the paper overnight. I'd say 12 to 24 hours, and then wring it out really well and then put it in your worm bin. Again, it's free, it's easy to come by, everybody's got plenty of it. We need to be recycling paper more, so in a worm bin is the perfect place to do it. But I kind of don't like the texture of vermicompost that is from paper waste. Now, another choice is shredded cardboard. This also has to be saturated, typically, especially if you're starting out with a worm bin. If you got a wet worm bin, dry paper, dry cardboard is just fine. I want to make sure that the cardboard you're using, though, is a corrugated cardboard. Don't use the kind that comes with the cereal box, that really dense stuff that takes forever to break down. Worms love corrugated cardboard, and they really like the glue that is used to glue the paper onto the corrugation. So that is a great choice. Again, just make sure that you're shredding it up as well as you can. I really like coco coir, which is coconut coir, which is the husks of coconuts that have been dried, dehydrated, and compressed into bricks. I find that coco coir ends up being a very soil-like texture that breaks down very quickly, and I have never had worms have any issues with coco coir. There's a lot of people out there that say you need to make sure that it's rinsed. I think almost all coco coirs that you can buy out there are rinsed, but make sure that you're reading the label on that stuff before you buy it. The bad thing about coco coir is that you need to buy it typically. Most people don't have it just sitting around their house, and it's normally imported from overseas, typically Asia. So if you're worried about kind of the zero waste aspect of that, coco coir may not be the best option. Another option people like that again has its downsides is peat moss. Peat moss has a consistency that's sort of like coco coir. Once it's wet and it's started to break down, it has a very, very soil-like quality to it as well. There are some sustainability concerns around peat moss, though, because of the way that it is mined. It's not considered to be a renewable resource, and it's normally imported from Canada and Eastern Europe. And I know that there are some people who have had some bad experiences with bad peat moss and have lost a lot of worms because of it. So buyer beware, but peat moss is a decent option. Another great option is just straight up compost. So compost, just like you would have in your backyard where you've got that 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, what's going to happen is that's going to go through a heating cycle, and then it's going to go through a cooling and then a curing period that's going to further increase that carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that can be a really good worm bedding. And it's also probably active with microbes, which is a really good thing too. Another good free option are leaves, yard waste, and wood chips. These can be a really good high carbon option for your worm bed. Now, a couple things to look out for when you're using these things is to make sure that wherever you're getting them from is not using herbicides and pesticides, especially the persistent herbicides that do not break down with composting, and they really won't break down with vermicomposting. So you need to be careful with that. Now, I like yard waste, but you also need to make sure that it's kind of gone through a mulching or a composting process. People will use leaf mold, which is really decomposing leaves, as bedding, and indeed that's where you're going to find composting worms in the wild is in leaf mold, or what's called leaf litter, and the detritus that's on the forest floor. So you want to make sure that your worm bedding looks something like that. It's not just dead leaves. So I like using yard waste. The only issue is I like to add it with other forms of bedding to diversify the bedding, especially because I really kind of worry about texture and if the worms are going to like the texture or not. And so again, I just like to add yard waste with other forms of bedding. Now, something we're going to experiment with today is something called Pitt Moss. Now, this is a commercially produced product made in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So you have to buy it, but it is made from recycled, organic, and natural materials, mostly paper waste and some other things. They're a little bit secretive about what's in it and how they use it, but the stuff checks out. People that I know and trust use it for their worm bedding. We're going to give it a try and see how it goes. So before we even start preparing our worm bedding, we want to make sure that our worm bin is ready to go. In this case today, I'm going to be starting with a new urban worm bag. You may be starting with something different, but for the purpose of using the urban worm bag, we want to make sure that that interior drawstring is cinched completely shut. That's going to make sure that the bedding that we put in there doesn't just fall through to the ground. Now, it's also a good idea that once that's cinched shut, is go ahead and keep that zipper open, and that's going to let any excess moisture that we add to the worm bin, it's going to let it exit out of the bottom. Once you know that you've got the moisture under control, you can go ahead and close that zipper, but in the meantime, I think it's a good idea just to leave it open. So we're going to wet down the Pitt Moss here, and we're going to just use regular old tap water to do it. And we want to make sure that we just keep working that water into the Pitt Moss and make sure that it gets uniformly moist. And I try not to say wet or saturated because I don't want you to think that this stuff needs to be dripping. It just needs to be uniformly moist. And I think you're going to see that even after we put the bedding into the urban worm bag, that the urban worm bag is going to drip because that bedding is holding more water than we're probably giving it credit for. So once we've got that worm bedding nice and moist, we're going to end up just dumping it right into the urban worm bag. Now, I like to do this several days before the worms even arrive. What I will do after this is I'm going to throw a banana peel or an apple core into that bedding, and that is going to provide a little bit of a food source for microbes to begin blooming, because we want this worm bin not to be a sterile place when the worms get here. We want a nice kind of microbially rich environment when the worms arrive. All right, guys, I hope you found this enjoyable and useful. And if you're interested in learning more about peat moss, go ahead and shoot me an email at steve@urbanwormcompany.com. It's very possible that I may have this for sale in small quantities that's appropriate for a home worm bin. If you want to learn more about worm bedding in general, go to urbanwormcompany.com/bedding. You can read a very informative blog post I wrote about this very subject. And if you want more videos, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. So thanks, guys. I appreciate you watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.